Uh, I should maybe start out by admitting that I'm maybe not the best placed person to talk about a country perspective on how to achieve the SDGs or how they ought to be financed or implemented at a country level, because the country that I'm from, I'm pretty sure is going to be very, very little affected by this. So therefore, my argument is going to be something that is primarily theoretical and is based on a paper that I've been working on sort of on and off during weekends with Matt Andrews, a colleague of mine. And this is really the first time that this is being given a trial run in front of an audience that cares about the stuff at all. So I might very well end up with a different outline for the paper after we're done in about 20 minutes time, 15 minutes plus discussion. So the first thing to start with, essentially the topic of this presentation is about ownership and international agreements like Sustainable Development Goals. How do they fit together? And my sort of very simple visualization in if an image says as much as 1,000 words, this is the image that I would choose. I'm not sure if some of you might have seen the title of the slide when it was pulled up, but do you know what sort of an animal we are looking at here? This is exactly, it's a chimera. So the title of the presentation is The Ownership Chimera. Now, for those of you who don't know what a chimera actually is, I went to Merriam-Webster and looked it up for you, and these are the two most salient definitions that you find in the dictionary about the chimera, which I think very aptly describes what I think about putting the idea of country ownership and the Sustainable Development Goals together in the same sentence. It's both an imaginary monster compounded of incongruous parts, and it's an unrealizable dream. Why? The first thing that I wanted to very quickly cover is that I find myself very, very confused by the notion of we. And I was sitting in on most of the sessions yesterday and heard a large number of different conversations about we have to do this, we will do that, we will achieve this, we have achieved the following things on the MDGs, and it's just never clear to me who are we talking about when we say we. Are we talking about the people in this room? Are we talking about the international aid industry, which is of course very heavily represented in this room? Are we talking about the world community, about all sort of consisting of all the governments? Are we talking about 6 billion people, which we have now sort of quickly decided to represent by a representative sample of about 75 mostly white people in this room? What is this we that we are referring to? And I don't think it's a trivial question to ask when you talk about something that claims to be the development agenda for the entire world. And I think this term should be entirely prohibited in this context. It should be an absolute requirement to say, when I say we, this is what I mean. This is the specific constituency or that particular group of actors that we are referring to. And for instance, if you did that and instead of we started to talk a lot about they, because a lot of what the SDGs is going to require is other people doing stuff who may have other interests, then all of these sentences sound a lot different from what they would otherwise, because then all of a sudden you are saying they have to mobilize domestic resources to implement this agenda. They were the ones who just achieved the MDGs or not, and they are the ones who are buying into this thing. They have to figure out how to get the private sector on board and so on and so forth, and I think that's a very different conversation. Another point that sort of is important to understand where this particular argument here is coming from is that I'm trying to be very careful about the distinction between a normative argument and a positive argument. So the normative, how things ought to be, and positive, how things actually are. the entirety of the next couple of slides is just going to be entirely about the positive. So I'm not going to talk about whether it's desirable to have an SDG agenda, whether it's desirable for the SDGs to work in a particular way, or whether certain elements or goals ought to be in the SDG agenda or not for the sake of the common good or for the sake of the planet. So this is purely about how realistic is it that any of this is ever going to happen. And that's an important distinction. Is like with the reference to the we, I think is something that is important to keep in mind, because my impression is a little bit that we, as in the people in this room, have very quickly moved ahead from we're sort of assuming that we've all bought into this, and a lot of these unspoken assumptions are entirely uncontroversial about how stuff is going to happen later on. The sort of the main transmission mechanism between international agreements and domestic actions, that's really what we're after here. I did a little bit of research in the run-up and was furiously reading up about all the acronyms and mechanisms and all that stuff, and I thought, well, the first thing that I want to find out is what have we learned from the MDGs, and did the MDGs actually work? And so obviously I went and Googled the massive literature out there that talks about MDGs and how they were achieved and to what extent aid can be attributed as a causal factor in MDG achievement rates. Because as you know, many international organizations have spent tremendous amounts of effort and resources to investigate this very salient question, which sort of ought to be the first one that you ask at the point that you're designing the successor framework. If you are scratching your head at this point about what sort of literature I'm referring to, then you are not the only person, because of course it's not there. I found a couple of papers, sort of a single-digit number of papers. There's the Steve Friedman paper from last year. There are a couple of Kenny Pritchett papers about the question of what is it that we learn from the NDGs, but there's not a lot of sort of very solid information about whether this actually worked and to what extent a country's sort of achievement rate of MDG targets has anything to do with the provision of aid. And that's, of course, the main mechanism of intervention that we're talking about in this context here. This was slightly confusing and disappointing to me, because the impression that I have is that there isn't much to be said about whether the MDGs were actually working, and the idea that we're now doubling down on this agenda with something that is far more ambitious and far more complicated on the basis of what we've learned from the first time around is, well, maybe not the most responsible way of making policy, certainly not particularly evidence-based, it strikes me. These are the points that I just covered. So I just want to make 2 points about how these things normally work in government domestically. So this is basic political science 101, that if you talk about domestic politics, nobody would ever assume that there is such a thing as country ownership of government policies. It doesn't happen. Even in democracies, those of you who know this stuff, you recognize that this is the median voter theorem sort of representation, that once you are casting about as a prospective government about people who would vote for you, as soon as you are at 51%, you're good and you go home. That means that the other 49% are not going to be represented by the agenda, the policy agenda that you're proposing. And so this sort of very simple visual representation is, if you have some people who are very interested in the government spending money on guns. There are other people who want to have the money spent on butter. There are some things in between and lots of different trade-offs, of course, and somewhere in the middle is where you're going to end up. And so the gun people are going to be unhappy and the butter people are going to be unhappy, and the people who want a little bit of gun and a little bit of butter, they are going to be all right. And if you multiply this with the sort of 500 policy areas in government that you have, then you obviously have a situation where the policy agenda of the government of the day, as represented by the budget of the government of the day, is not going to be in any way a sort of a complete representation or a consensus result of what everybody wants. And it can't be. I mean, it's a theoretical impossibility because people want different things. This is not about the sort of an argument about the incompleteness or insufficiency of majoritarian government. It just wouldn't work in any other way. And of course, if you're not in a democracy, then the wind set of what keeps you in power is going to be even smaller, potentially very, very significantly smaller. So countries don't own the stuff that they do, not in any meaningful sense of the word. And of course, if you then transport this to the international sphere, where you're talking about international agreements between governments, then you're sort of multiplying the subset of what it is that everybody can agree on by the number of countries and by the number of policy areas that you're trying to find an agreement, to the point where the more indicators you have and the more countries you have signing up to that indicator, the fewer people within each particular country is actually going to feel that, yes, this is the sort of agenda that I would sign up to and that I would vote for if somebody held a referendum on it. And again, it's sort of fairly obvious that this is the case. Now, something that we did was to go and just think a little bit about these mechanisms of translation. I don't really have to cover this now because Carolina sort of used the example of Colombia very well to sort of go over this ground. We then went and looked at how can we categorize different kinds of international agreements that would maybe give us a little bit of guidance for how these things might play out in the case of the SDGs and the MDGs. And so we are saying, well, if you have an agreement between governments, the simplest and easiest thing that has the least to do with domestic political arrangements and domestic political affairs is an agreement between countries that is purely about that country's international conduct. So if you have something like a peace agreement or a defensive treaty, then all the actions that you're agreeing on is about international relations. And of course, arms industries and other domestic interests are affected by these sorts of things, and it's never sort of purely international and apolitical, but the messing about with domestic politics is relatively minimal, and historically we've seen tons and tons and tons of these, and that's basically the subject of international politics as conservatively defined. You also have international agreements that are sort of about regulatory affairs, a lot of the stuff to do with addressing global public problems, finding collective solutions to that, falls very, very squarely into that area, and domestic politics starts to get more complicated. And for things like, for instance, reorganizing the way that you're producing fridges so that they are less bad for the ozone layer. There are domestic interests which are affected by that, and it's not an immaterial question how that plays out in different countries, because people obviously like their fridges and they want them to be made, and fridge makers care about how much money they make. But again, it is something where there is an international record. These things have worked out in the past, and you can have reasonable expectations that they are going to work out in the future as well. The next one is about international agreements that regulate public expenditures. This is something that is extremely difficult to do because the national budget reflects domestic priorities. It doesn't reflect international priorities. We haven't found very many examples where this is being done in a very systematic and sort of major meaningful way, except for the MDGs, where we don't really know whether that really worked in a sort of meaningful sense of the word. We know about things like poverty reduction strategy papers and other sort of bureaucratic mechanisms of translation, that they're actually working incredibly poorly and are usually not particularly well translated into national budgetary decision making. Now, the final one is the international agreements about not just what it is that you do as a government and what it is that you spend your money on as a government, what reflects the political priorities of you as a government, but what you actually are. So what sort of an entity do you become? It's about changing the domestic setup of the entire institutional arrangements of a country. And this is where the sustainable development goals are moving into at the moment. There are, of course, other examples for this, like for instance, the Holy Alliance of the early 19th century. This was an alliance between Prussia, Austria, and Russia, and the only way that you could be a member was that if you had a king or an emperor who was appointed by God. So it was the group of countries who represented a particular mode of government that was set against these silly notions of popular representation. So it wasn't about what you were doing as a country, it was what you looked like on the inside. That was your ticket for entry. Comic-Con, the sort of the economic Warsaw Pact equivalent of economic association centered on the Soviet Union is another example of this. The sort of the ideas of the peace and state building goals of the New Deal for Fragile States are another example of this. And in a way, this sort of the supranational element of the European Union is of course another example of this. And I think all of this is completely fine as long as you're aware of the magnitude of the challenge that you're getting into. So if you are creating a sustainable development goal that talks about the transparency, accountability, and inclusiveness of your institutions, and you're expecting the entire world to sign up to that agenda, then you're essentially talking about a fundamental transformation of the institutional setup of those countries. And some people are talking about this. There were sessions yesterday where people were talking about this very explicitly. This is what we want. We want a fundamental economic and social transformation of all the countries that are covered by the SDGs. And that's fine. But you need to realize that it's unprecedented, incredibly difficult, and very, very likely to not work. So what is to be done? I thought it would be good if I wasn't entirely theoretical, but also practical. I listed these in descending order of realism. So scrapping the SDG agenda altogether is, no, I wanted to say in ascending order of realism. Sorry, I'm completely destroyed. It totally blew my own pun. That's very unfortunate. So the scrapping the SDG agenda altogether is obviously the least realistic of these. Persuading the aid industry and donor agencies to give up on their SDGs ambitions is far less realistic than the next one, which is to just come right out and do the honest and open thing and establish a world state. If you had a world state, then of course it would be perfectly capable and perfectly feasible to determine expenditure composition in countries, institutional setup in countries, the ways that you organize economic and social relations in countries, the way that you would in a federal state. So the US government meddles in all sorts of different ways in the ways that US states do these sorts of things, and of course the European Union is sort of in a very, very hesitant, sort of supranational, almost there kind of way, moving in that direction. And if we had a world state, then the SDGs would make a lot of sense and would be completely realistic. And maybe this whole discussion about international public finance, I think, is maybe the most honest attempt to sort of think through the implications in that direction. Then the third one, which is possibly the most realistic one, is just to give up on the idea that the SDGs will have anything to do with targets and that the SDGs are going to use any funding that comes from the governments themselves. If this is an agenda that is led by aid agencies and is a way of saying we're putting these funds on the table because this is our normative, morally desirable vision for the world, and if you're buying into it, then here are the funds that you can tap into, then that might be a possibility. But the idea that the international community can realistically assume that it would be able to impound domestic tax resources that sane politicians who are accountable to their taxpayers would be used for this agenda, which inevitably does not represent their interest, then that is just not a very wise course of action. And with that, I shall conclude, and I apologize for going over.
For taking the 20 minutes as announced. Thank you, Philipp.